There's nothing better than a good sentence, is there? Well, except maybe a good essay. Welcome back. Now, I really do love a good sentence. In fact, I spent all of grad school studying writing style and thinking about sentences and what makes them great. Sentences are the basic unit of any story, poem, or essay, and if you spend any amount of time around writers and the people adjacent to them, you'll end up hearing a lot of talk about sentences. But even though sentences are important, that's not what we're talking about today. Because if you pay too much attention to your sentences, they can derail you in the sneakiest of ways. I may have shared this story before, but when I was in college, I wrote a paper that I thought was pretty great, and a few days later, I got it back from my teacher with a grade that was much lower than the A that I had expected. I hadn't yet learned to take feedback gracefully, so let's say I was vexed. Luckily, my teacher was kind enough to call me over after class and explain why I got the grade that I got. And essentially, it boiled down to this. He said, "Your writing is good writing, but it's just not the kind of writing that this assignment was asking for." And he told me that he gave me that score because he didn't want me to end up in a position where writers could accuse me of using style to distract them from a lack of substance. If I remember right, I think the words he used were linguistic prestidigitation. And let's be honest, I don't think those were the words he used, those were the exact words, because they've been branded indelibly into my brain. And I've seen symptoms of a similar situation countless times now from the other side. Most commonly, I think about it when I'm reviewing the comments that people leave each other on peer reviews. Usually those comments are things like, "Great job, I really can't think of any suggestions. Maybe fix some of your punctuation and spelling and you're going to be good to go." And then I get to see the final draft and it's full of glaring, paper-breaking issues, and I wonder how it ever got through the peer review process without anyone ever saying anything about them. But I've started to realize that I've come to think about my writing differently in the years since getting that paper back, and it's a way that newer writers just aren't thinking. But it's a way that can make all the difference, so I want to talk about it here today. And of course, there's no more natural place to begin than with toasters. So let's imagine that you're in a class and you've been given the assignment to build a toaster. Your final exam will be based on your toaster's ability to produce toast according to your instructor's specifications. And you've had a lot of experience in previous classes with connecting wires and tightening screws and building circuits, so you feel pretty good about it. You've never built a toaster, but it's just a bunch of wires and screws, so how hard can it be? You begin by pulling a wire out of your supply box, and you attach it to another wire, flawlessly, I might add, and you continue to do the same thing, attaching one wire to the next, and then to the next, and so on. As you make progress, you start to realize that your network of wires doesn't quite look like a traditional toaster. But that doesn't bother you. You're an innovator, and you know that nobody else in class is tightening screws as securely as you are. You did get an A+ in screw tightening 201 after all. So you get into the flow of things and end up working later into the night than you planned, but you were enjoying your work, so you finish up and get a little bit of sleep before taking your invention to class for the peer review. In class, you show your work to your assigned classmates and you take a look at theirs as well. You're quick to notice and helpfully point out where they have loose screws and fraying wires, because, of course, you would hate for them to lose any points. But all of your reviewers just lean in close and carefully inspect every connection in your invention. Not a screw out of place, and cable management that would make any tech enthusiast blush. But you also went above and beyond. The assignment didn't require you to include an indicator light to show when the toaster was turned on, but you were on a roll and you had a spare color-changing LED anyway. So you take your toaster home after class and look it over. As much as you liked your classmates' praise, you're also a little disappointed. Surely there was something wrong with it, something that you overlooked. But no, your peers couldn't think of anything and you can't think of a single way to improve your wiring either, so you go to bed early and look forward to impressing your instructor during the final at the end of the week. On the day of the final, you take your project up to the front of the room and take a step back, eagerly awaiting the same kind of praise from your instructor that you got from your peers. And you do get some of that praise right away. Great wiring, your instructor says. There's a lot of technical skill on display here. Gee, you say that to everyone, I bet, you think? But then, your instructor asks a devastating question. My only real issue, and it's kind of a serious one actually, is where do I put the bread? You don't remember much after that, but you find yourself sitting in your room that evening reading your instructor's grade sheet that says, "This is really an impressive device. But it's not a toaster, and that was the single most important requirement for this assignment." So let's talk about what happened. Our technical wizard displayed a lot of skill. Every individual piece was attached to the next one in the sequence in an artful and impressive way. It was an immaculately crafted device, but it was the wrong kind of device. And here's the issue. In this hypothetical scenario, our builder began with a single wire and then attached another wire to it, and so on and so forth. For them, this was just a process of attaching pieces together in the most perfect way possible. And here's the issue. In this hypothetical scenario, our builder started with a single wire and then proceeded to attach another wire to it, and then another wire to that one, and so on and so forth. For them, this whole process was just one of putting the pieces together as perfectly and elegantly as possible. But they weren't thinking beyond whatever the next piece they were going to attach was. In other words, they weren't working on building an excellent toaster. They were focused on tightening each screw just the right amount. As a result, they ended up building a beautiful but worthless electrical appliance. Now imagine how all of this might have changed if instead of just working on attaching each piece to the next one as perfectly as possible, they started with a plan, maybe something like this. So the goal is to build a toaster that will produce toast according to the instructor's specifications. What kind of features will such a device need to have? Well, it's going to need somewhere to put bread. It's going to need some element that gets hot enough to toast the bread. It will probably need some way of timing the toaster so that you can control how dark the toast gets. And of course, you might want to include some mechanism for returning the bread once it is toast. Now we have a basic plan, but we can go even further. What parts do each of these mechanisms need? With something like this, the job is not just to attach one piece to the next as perfectly as possible. Instead, it's to build a functioning toaster by assembling each of its major components. In the end, there might be a few imperfect connections, but a faulty toaster that works is a whole lot better than a perfectly assembled device that does nothing. And it reflects a fundamental difference in thinking too. It's the difference between thinking about the project one piece at a time and thinking about the project in terms of its overall structure and purpose. Okay, so that's enough about toasters. You might already see where we're going with this, but let's talk about what this has to do with our writing. What's going wrong when an argument makes it through a peer review process and still doesn't have a clear thesis? What's happening when somebody turns in a short story that's described in minute and delightful detail, but it's a city where nothing actually happens? What's the root issue with a poem that has perfect rhyme and meter, but doesn't really say anything that's worth saying? In each of these cases, I think we have a writer who isn't thinking structurally. They're just thinking about their writing from one sentence to the next, in the same way that our inventor was just thinking from one wire to the next. And to see what I mean, let's talk about that short story that just describes a city. I can imagine the writer sitting down with a prompt that asks them to write a story that happens in an interesting setting. So with that focus on sitting occupying their mind, they sit down to start describing their setting. They talk about where the city sits geographically. Maybe they describe some of the industries that keep the city humming along. They might spend some time talking about its architecture and even its history. And each sentence is a joy to read. There's specific, vivid detail, and the narrator has a charming voice. It's a blast to read, but then you get to the end and realize that nothing happened. There is no character development, no conflict, no plot. It's really just a description of a city. And no matter how beautiful that description is, if your reader is expecting a narrative, a story, then this description is going to disappoint them. So instead of just starting out with sentences that each describe the setting you're supposed to focus on, start out by thinking about structure. What sections does your story actually need? Of course, there are countless ways to structure a plot, but you're probably going to want an introductory section, some kind of section that gets the conflict going, one that leads to the resolution, and so on. See, when you just start writing sentences and only sentences, it isn't that hard to get lost along the way. If all you're thinking about is the next step, you can easily lose sight of your destination, and you might end up somewhere you never planned on, and somewhere your readers didn't want to go. And of course, there's room for serendipity and discovery, but I think this describes the key difference between who I was as a writer when I got that bad grade and who I am as a writer now. Back then, I was only thinking about sentences and words. I got a prompt, I sat down to work on it, and I wrote one sentence after the next. I knew that each of the sentences was good, and so that was enough for me to think that my writing overall was good. Now, though, I start by thinking about structure. I figure out what pieces I'll need in order to build a toaster before I ever start assembling individual wires. For example, when I was getting to the end of graduate school and I had one school year left to write a dissertation that was hundreds of pages long, I was, at first, overwhelmed and intimidated. How in the world was I going to write sentence after sentence for 300 pages? Well, I wasn't. Instead, I took a step back and thought about structure first. What individual components would help me to build this larger document? And once I figured out what each chapter was going to do, then I tried to figure out what each section in each chapter should do. That way, I didn't feel like I was actually writing a 300-page dissertation. I was writing a few 30-page essays, each made out of sections that were only a few pages each. And I'm realizing that this is fundamentally why things that I think should be obvious about a piece of writing make it through a peer review and onto my desk. The fact is that after years of experience and practice, I'm not thinking about reading and writing in the same way that newer writers are. In fact, and please don't tell anyone, it's vanishingly rare for me to ever comment on somebody's usage or punctuation. It's because I'm much more interested in having a functioning toaster than in having every screw and wire attached correctly. I mean, why bother commenting on faulty wiring if there isn't even a place to put the bread? So the trick is to start thinking structurally about the purpose and composition of the piece as a whole, and not just about the sequence of individual sentences. When new writers are in a peer review situation, they can only comment on what they know about. And if all they know about is sentences, then they'll comment on sentences. They'll point out misplaced commas or misspelled words, and once all the screws are tightened and all the wires are lined up, they'll say, "Great job, no suggestions." And then the raw toast piles up everywhere. Really, it comes down to this. New writers tend to be overly concerned with correct sentences, but more experienced writers step back and make sure that the piece as a whole is doing its job and that each of its individual sections is pulling its weight. So a couple of things as we pull all these pieces together. First, today's show was inspired by experiences I've had with peer review and things I've read lately on the subject. Ultimately, my goal is to talk about how you can give good feedback and what to do when you receive feedback, but we need to have an understanding of structural thinking before we can do that. And second, some of the things we've talked about probably sound pretty familiar. We've talked before about the importance of writing with purpose and working from a plan or an outline to structure your work. But just telling somebody to write an outline isn't really helpful if they don't know how to think structurally. I mean, you could create an outline that just tells you to take one wire and attach it to the next one and to the next one and to the next one, but that outline won't really get you anywhere. An outline is really only useful if it's helping you to think in terms of purposeful components, your heating elements, your timers, and your electromagnets. So this is less about a practical skill and more about a mindset shift. It's about moving from seeing your writing as a sequence of individual sentences to seeing it as a whole piece with a specific purpose. So yeah, it's good to think about your writing style, and we love to talk about things like character development and world building, but these are not ends in themselves. You can't tell a great story with world building by itself any more than you can build a great toaster just by attaching individual wires to each other. The little bits of writing are worthwhile only when they exist as purposeful components in the larger structure. A witty and delightful description of a city is great world building, but it's really crummy storytelling if nothing ever happens in that city. You could say that this is about not missing the forest for the trees, and it is. You don't want to lose sight of the overall purpose of the piece because you're paying too much attention to individual sentences. But it's also a little more than that, because it's not just seeing the toaster instead of the wires. It's also developing an understanding of the major components of a toaster and the role that each one plays, as well as the role that each individual piece plays in its respective component. And it's one thing to say that this is a better way to think, but it's another to show you how to do it. So here are some practical suggestions to get you started towards thinking more structurally. First, when you're reading, take a step back and try to think about how the piece was put together. If, for example, you're reading a novel, try to identify the different phases or sections of the story. You might even ask yourself what role each chapter is playing. What purpose does it serve? If you're reading a textbook or academic articles in school, you'll probably notice that every section of the text has a heading, and that's not an accident. The authors of those texts are trying to show you explicitly how the pieces are put together. People tend to think that academics are trying to be obscure or that poets are trying to prevent you from understanding what they have to say. But the reality is that academic texts and poems are some of the most structurally explicit texts out there. They couldn't tell you any more clearly how the writing is put together and the job that each piece is doing, But a lot of writers don't know how to read for structure, so they just see a wall of academic jargon or a string of poetic lines and assume that they can't understand it. But just remember, headings and section breaks are there to tell you how a piece is put together so that you can comprehend it more easily. It's like if a toaster had all of its components labeled with an explanation of what each component was doing. Good writing will make its structure pretty obvious because it's a comprehension tool, so take advantage of the opportunities when you're reading to pay attention to how experienced writers are putting their work together. And I might stop just short of recommending it because it's not terribly exciting, but one of the most valuable things I did in school was just read things and then create outlines of the things that I had read. In fact, in grad school, I had more than one class where that's basically all we did. We read academic articles and we went section by section to make sure that we understood the structure of the article and what each piece was doing to contribute to its overall purpose. Then when it comes to your own writing, of course, you can begin by getting into the practice of planning your work before you start, whether that's an outline, a mind map, or whatever else works, just as long as you have some document with a diagram of the toaster you're trying to build. And when you're in the process of writing actual sentences, you can stop every now and then and ask yourself why you're writing what you're writing. What is it contributing to the overall purpose and structure of the piece? If it's just there because you like it or because it's kind of interesting, then maybe it's something you should cut. Because remember, you're building a toaster, so do you really need a lot of components that don't contribute to the actual toasting? Of course, I'd caution you not to get too narrow-minded about your purpose. There are, for example, some aspects of this show that I know some people find extraneous or even distracting from the singular purpose of transmitting information from my brain to yours. But here's the thing, if I treated you like hard drives and just attempted to download freeze-dried information into you, I don't really think anyone would be here. For one, I'd be bored out of my mind, and I think you might be too. So is a little bit of music in a video going to help you to learn any better? Well, maybe not, but I'd like to acknowledge that we have hearts as well as brains, so I'd argue that a little bit of melody to lighten the mood is going to be worth it. Oh, and you may have noticed that these videos are always broken into chapters, and that's exactly what this has been about. I don't know how to write anymore without thinking in terms of structured, purposeful sections, and it's so helpful to me as a writer and as a reader that I want to make it explicit for you too, so that you'll know why I'm saying what I'm saying at each step of the way. And maybe this little self-reflection is a bit of a detour, but still, it illustrates the point. Okay, so just to put a bow on the whole thing, one of the major differences between new writers and experienced writers is that new writers tend to think in terms of individual sentences, while more experienced writers tend to think in terms of the structure of the overall piece. As a result, new writers can write strings of engaging and well-composed sentences that in the end don't actually end up saying what they needed to say. That's why it's so common to get well-written stories without plots, well-behaved poems without insight, and professional-sounding papers without any arguments. So if you want to take your writing to the next level, start thinking in terms of structure. Don't put all your focus into tightening screws just right. Instead, make sure that you're building a useful component for a working toaster. When you start to think structurally, you don't need to look at a 10 or 30-page paper and then go hide under a blanket. Instead, you can think about each of the individual components that need to go into that project and pay attention to each one in turn. Writing a 10-page paper can be hard, but writing 4 2.5-page sections is pretty easy. As long as you know what you're doing, it can only be a breeze. And of course, I can't give you an outline for every writing project because you won't always be building a toaster, but the principle is still the same. Even if you're building a microwave, it's still important to think about each of the major components before you start tightening any screws. Because in the end, it is infinitely more important for your toaster to toast than for all of your wires to be color coordinated. Of course, if the toast is good, then color-coordinated wires are more than welcome. So go out there and think about structure, and I'll stay here and make some toast because I'm suddenly in the mood for it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.